Well, I'm glad for the opportunity to stand before you today. And my topic is of an historical nature. We're going to speak about the temple. I have an accent, as you can tell. Some of you just look at me. It's English. It's English. It will take a few minutes, and I'll try to slow down. And the only thing that is different than my last visit here a couple of years ago is that now I have to use my glasses the whole time. Yeah, that's the only thing. Besides, everything is as usual. Well, folks, the topic for this morning is speaking about the temple, to be more specific, Herod's temple. But in order to get to Herod's temple, we need to understand a little bit about Jerusalem's topography. And you will see later on how the whole plan behind temple and temple worship was well integrated in the natural circumstances in the area. And therefore, the plan is not to go that much into details about what was the priestly schedule in the temple, but more to give you some basic observations about the temple's position in the heart of the people back in the days of Herod. And we need to make the distinction. We're speaking about the days of Jesus. And some of you will be surprised to hear that there was no national consensus about the importance of the temple back then. Some people thought that the temple in its present form, and Jesus was one of them, right? He was not the only one who was upset with corruption in the area. There was some debates about the temple's position, not about the location that God chose many centuries earlier, about the practices of the temple in the days of Herod, and I'll try to focus on that as well. On top of which, some data regarding this enormous project, the largest man-made mountain or platform in the world, still standing, was built in that occasion, 32 acres big. That's bigger than any other thing. So just the measurements of this huge project are very impressive, and we'll speak about them as well. So it's more than just focusing on something very specific about a temple. We need to broaden the picture and have some other information as well. Well, let's start with the Word of God. Always good to start the presentation with that, speaking about one place of worship. By the way, you'll be surprised later on because I'll ask a question which I will answer as well, but I'll answer it only later on. Were the reading scriptures in temple worship? That's a good question, huh? And your answer will be, of course they did. Well, and let me just stop here for a minute, okay? Because you need to understand that while the temple was standing, that was the focal point of biblical Judaism, and not that much the Bible. The Jewish scriptures weren't even canonized yet. And therefore, the Jewish world back then is a little different than the Jewish world today. And since we do speak about the days of Jesus, it's very important for people like yourselves, reading your scriptures, to have a deeper understanding. What were the practices like and what was the position of the temple in the heart of the people. So this is, of course, the biblical commandment for one place of worship. We do need to recognize a little bit about Jerusalem's topography because it's very significant. Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot that I need to do the... Yeah, let's have the next one. Thank you. Well, here comes the topography. And if you go from left to right, all these names you should be familiar with, and I can see by scanning around that many of you have been to Jerusalem, so that would be a nice refreshment maybe for you to go over some of the information. You do see the mountains and you see the valleys if you can read the screen from over there, and you do see that the city itself covers an area which is lower than the mountains around. And when the Bible tells us in Psalms 125, as the mountains round about Jerusalem, so the Lord is all around his people, this is a very accurate description. In other words, when you're making your way to Jerusalem, from each direction that you're coming, you're climbing the mountains. However, you don't see the city on the very top. Jerusalem is not situated on top of the hills. It's situated in a big natural arena surrounded by higher mountains. And what a great vision that is when you get to the top of the hills, after a long journey, sometimes coming from Europe, sometimes coming from Babylon, sometimes coming from Galilee. You climb the mountains, you are tired, you are singing psalms of ascent to lift up your spirit, but you don't see the town. Not until your foot are standing on the mountains overlooking the city. And you will see later on when Herod built his temple how the topography was so significant in temple worship. Because for the holidays, for the feasts, thousands of people came to town, in fact, hundreds of thousands, and the city was not big enough to accommodate everybody. Josephus Flavius, the main source of information, a Jewish historian, Joseph son of Mattathias, tells us that one Passover they were offering 250,000 lambs. That was the Passover meal of 250,000 families. That's millions of people that came to town. And therefore, the whole ritual, so to speak, of the temple worship had to consider also the topography. Because keep in mind, there was a big challenge the laws about tabernacle, the laws about the Ark of the Covenant were given in the desert, and the desert's topography is totally different. Once you come to Jerusalem and God chose that place of worship, you need to consider the elements. Sometimes you need to consider the topography. So the Bible gives us the principles. The details had to be added by commentators, teachers of the law, etc. So Jerusalem's topography is very important to understand the rest of the story. And here's a rare air photo taken by German pilots in 1917 of Jerusalem. And what you saw on a diagram, you can see actually an air photo over there. And you see the Kidron Brook. And next to it, let's just run the whole slide, please. And I do it on mine as well. Yep. What you see over there, therefore, are the mountains and the valleys. On the right-hand side, you see the Kidron Brook, which means a dark place in Hebrew, also known as the Valley of Jehoshaphat, a place where God will judge the nations according to Joel chapter 3. And then you see in the center, the Central Valley. On the left-hand side, the Valley of Hinnom, when Jacob shared yesterday about the Israelites offering their sons to the Molech, burning them in the valley. That was the Valley of Gehenna. In Hebrew means hell, by the way. And then you see the arrow that points to the city of David. And most important to our story today, of course, you see Mount Moriah, which is the next one, please. All right, yeah, over there. So that will be Mount Moriah on the top of what we also call the Eastern Hill. So once again, keep in mind the topography, the geography, because everything is part of the temple rituals as well. If we zoom in and we look at that picture a little closer, so once again, zooming into the area of the city of David and Temple Mount, you do see that these two locations are on the same hillside. Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, the Eastern Hill, Mount Zion, all these names refer to one spot, one rock, one mountain in Jerusalem, is on the northern side of the city of David. So when Psalms 48 tells us Mount Zion on the side of the north, the city of the great king, you do see the Temple Mount is on the northern side of the city of David. The next one. Thank you. You just run the whole thing. A little confusing because they need to do it there, I need to do it here, and my skills are not that advanced yet when it comes to computers. What do you see? All the names of the mountain. It's Temple Mount, it's Mount Moriah, Mount Zion, the Eastern Hill. These are the four names for the same mountaintop. Well, what makes it so important? Well, a lot of traditions and a lot of events that we believe took place on that specific rock. You see, people believe that the world is holy, created by God. Israel is holier, Jerusalem is holier, one rock, one stone is the one that is the focal point of all the attention, all the controversy, and that's the top of Mount Moriah. Our tradition is that when God started to create this world, he started right over there. That's why it's called the foundation stone. We also believe that Abraham was commanded to offer Isaac, and God showed that specific mountaintop, that's where you need to offer Isaac to me. And we also believe that Jacob, that had the ladder and the angels going up and down in Genesis 28, same location. And of course, the threshing floor that David purchased to stop the angel of the Lord from destroying Jerusalem after counting the fighting men. I'm sure that some of you know what I'm talking about. All these events took place in that very same location, and that's where God ordered David and Solomon to build a house. When we speak about the temple, we need to distinguish first temple from second temple. It's very important. The days of the first temple, the temple was not the most important thing in the hearts of the people. The Bible always speaks against high places. High places are more popular to some extent than the temple was. And every now and then the kings of Judea are ordering to renovate the temple, and they are surprised that the priests are not working well enough. They take the money for themselves, as in the days of King Joash. Let me ask you another question. Where were the books of Moses? Was there a law? Well, we are not even positive about that. Because in the days of Josiah, they find a scroll in the temple's basement, believed to be the scroll of Leviticus, and everybody's very surprised. What do we mean surprised? Wasn't there a book that they were reading from, the law of Moses? Where was that? Well, we do not know. Because the days of the Old Testament, temple practice, the Bible is not mentioning the existence of the law of Moses, which is quite amazing. Because Deuteronomy 17, speaking about the king of the Hebrews, says very clearly, every king should write himself a book of the law of Moses and read it day and night, and one for the archives. Well, did they do that? Apparently they didn't. And once again, as Jacob mentioned yesterday, that's why the punishment of the exile. Worshipping in high places, worshipping other gods, not considering the temple the most important thing. So the exile in Babylon was a key point, a key understanding to what will happen if we disobey once again. The lesson was well received and well learned. Because when Cyrus gives his declaration, oh, I'm sorry, I'm way ahead of everything. Yeah, go ahead, the whole slide, thank you. When Cyrus, king of Persia, gives his declaration, people learned the lesson. The lesson of the exile was, God promised we are going to go back to Jerusalem, but it's a conditioned one if we stop worshiping idols and if we make Jerusalem and Mount Moriah the only place of worship. And therefore the lesson had to be studied. It was Ezekiel's job to teach the people in exile what is the lesson of the exile. So speaking about the second temple, yes, we speak about the most important thing in Jewish life. That was the temple. We don't read, not even once, the people being criticized for idols, high places, marrying foreign women, yes, Ezra and Nehemiah fighting against that. But that was done with as well. Which brings us to the days of the second temple and the one that was built by Zerubbabel. When Cyrus gave his declaration, he didn't speak about restoration of the Jewish kingdom. He spoke about building a temple. And a man by the name of Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua are leading about 50,000 people, give or take, back to Jerusalem, rebuilding an altar, not the temple yet. You see, it's also interesting. You can have sacrificial system without the building. And the sacrifices were the main thing, and not that much the temple. And for 20 years, the Israelites are offering sacrifices on the altar built by Zerubbabel, but there's no temple yet. And only when the circumstances were right, the second year of Darius, king of Persia, the second temple is dedicated. As the Bible tells us, wasn't a very impressive building. And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah give us the account of the elders of Israel quite disappointed when they see this new building. But God promises his people, through the prophets, the glory of this one will be far beyond the glory of the first one. A couple of things are missing which are very important. There's no Ark of the Covenant in that temple. No one knows where the Ark is. Did you hear me? No one knows. Too many people say that they do. Well, check with Indiana Jones. No one knows about the Ark. The other thing this is missing is the Orem and Tumim. The Orem and Tumim was part of the high priest's garments. We do not know exactly how it was working, but when the king had a question from God, he was asking the question through the high priest, and God's answer was given miraculously through the Urim and Tumim. That part of the high priest's garment is no longer there. But another temple is being built, and it's also very interesting. We don't have a specific order to build another temple. Once they start and they hesitate, the prophets are encouraging them to carry on with the construction. And that's why maybe we don't have the specifics of the building. Solomon's temple, all the details. Ezekiel's temple, the third one, all the details. Second temple, nothing. And the question is why? Well, we don't have an answer for that. At least I don't have an answer for that. But the second temple was built, no doubt, in the same way, the same image of the first one, because the guidelines of Solomon's temple are very clear. But the Bible is not giving us specifics of the second temple. So the Urim and Tumim are missing. The Hasmonean kings are enlarging some of the temple, but we know very little about that temple before the days of Herod. Which brings us, of course, to the days of Herod and the building of, actually, what temple would it be? We had one built by Solomon, second one built by Zerubbabel. How do we call Herod's temple? Careful now. Can we call it the third temple? Not really. Second. But how many buildings were standing on top of Mount Moriah when Herod built his? 3. All right? And the reason why we cannot call Herod's temple the third temple is that through the whole construction of Herod's temple, the sacrificial system didn't stop. They carried on with sacrifices that were built on the same altar, built by Zerubbabel, and that was to solve the problem. And now to call Herod's temple the third temple, we're still waiting for this one to be built. Is that clear? It's a very important point. And part of the old buildings integrated in Herod's building as well. That's also very important to understand. It wasn't one building built on the ruins of the other one, but they show the continuity through the sacrificial system that never stopped through the whole construction, and that was a major construction. Are you still with me? Are you comfortable with my accent? It's okay. Well, some of you look at me with shock and horror, and I always wonder, what is the problem? Well, sources, it's not the one that I'm looking for. Isn't there a slide before this one? Yes. The sources of information are also very important. Well, the Bible. The Bible, the Gospels, and the book of Acts are telling us quite a lot of information about Herod's temple. Josephus Flavius, the Jewish historian by the name of Joseph, son of Mattathias, always a good source. He adds quite a lot to the whole story. Herod's motivation, the Romans' consent, Sanhedrin approach, etc. He is the one that supplements what the Bible tells us about a temple. Jewish oral law, the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud. Now this is very important, and you need to understand why. Most of these temple traditions you will not find in the scriptures. We speak about commentaries, we speak about traditions. If you go to the law of Moses, 613 commandments, about 200 speak about the tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrifices, not about the building that will be called a temple. And therefore, the changes required some adjustments. These adjustments were done when commentators, you can call them maybe super rabbis, not every rabbi is a commentator, made their observation and added the details. And that's not in the scriptures. That's the outcome of traditions and customs, etc. And also, when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they were not written down yet. You know, a priest was training all of his life to perform once in a lifetime, maybe in temple worship, by casting lots. The Bible tells us when Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, came to serve in the temple, he was waiting to find what job he's supposed to perform by casting lots. Which means that they were hoping after the temple was gone, it's going to be rebuilt. And therefore, we need to keep these traditions and pass them orally from father to son, but not write it down. Only centuries later, when the bitter realization that the temple is not going to rebuild soon totally penetrated, so to speak, to people's ideas, they said, okay, let's write it down. And therefore, some of these traditions were written down 400 years later, 500 years later. There is no guarantee that this is very accurate. But we do have a lot of information, and even if partially accurate, it's good enough to give us an idea of temple worship. And keep in mind, we speak about the days of Jesus. We speak about the days of Herod. And therefore, the Mishnah and the Gemara are very important. Not that much the, I would say, theological aspect, but the information that they are providing. Some information that we don't have in any other sources. The other source of information are the Greek and the Roman writers. One of them says the following: the temple in Jerusalem is one of the marvels of the world. It's a whole temple, not a single statue in it. Well, go figure. That was the Roman observation. How can you build a temple without having statues? By the way, a very important by the way, not only Jews came to worship in the temple of Jerusalem. You see, if you're a pagan and you believe in the 500 gods anyhow, you have no problem to add the God of Israel as one of the gods that you believe in. And therefore, when Solomon was praying, when he dedicated the first one, let no foreigner, or God asking God to answer the praise of foreigners, or Isaiah said that no foreigner should be feel stranger on Temple Mount, that was the acknowledgement that our God is universal. And he rules everywhere. And keep in mind, the mindset of people back then was not like that. The gods were limited to certain locations. That was the whole idea of paganism. Well, if you believe in so many gods, you can easily add the God of Israel as another deity that you're worshiping. If you were Jewish, you only worship one God. But the temple was open to welcome and accommodate everybody who came to the temple for that purpose, at least for a limit. There was a certain line that only Jews could go closer to the building and not non-Jews. And that's why Paul was arrested, as we read in Acts chapter 7, accused for bringing a non-Jew into the restricted Jewish area. And recently, archaeological excavations, which is, of course, maybe the most accurate source of information today, and lots of excavations are going on, forgive me, around Temple Mount. And you do understand the whole world is watching. The closer you come to Temple Mount with excavations today, you've got yourself a world war. It's the same dynamic, and therefore we are a little limited in how close can we get in excavating around the temple unless we want to ignite a huge fire. It's so easy in Jerusalem. Say something about a temple, even a stupid rumor. If it comes on the right side, you've got yourself a major problem. And therefore, archaeology is very helpful, but not the temple that much, the area around the temple. Well, Herod's temple was indeed a magnificent complex, as you'll see in a few minutes. But before that, we need to speak about the man himself, the King of the Jews. A very interesting situation in the life of the Jewish people. For the first time ever, a non-Jewish king is the king of the nation. And that brings a lot of tension, a lot of animosity. How could that be? Well, Herod was not a choice made by the people. He was a choice made by the Roman Empire. The Roman style of ruling people when they conquered a nation was not to proclaim it a province first if there was a problem. In the case of the Jews, professional troublemakers of history, there was a problem. Because the Jews refused to worship Caesar as a deity. Judea was located on the eastern border of Rome, bordering with Persia, a mighty enemy. And therefore, we need to pay close attention to what the Jews are scheming. And if we'll proclaim it a province ruled by Romans, they will not cooperate. And therefore, we need to find somebody from the locals who is willing to rule in Rome's behalf, who is skillful for the job, and the Jews will accept him. And they choose a man who comes from an Idumean convert family by the name of Herod, later on the Great. Nobody was called the Great when they were still alive. This is a title given to you after you die usually. Alexander, Genghis Khan, and all the others. And Herod is the choice made by the Romans. For the first time ever, the Jewish people have a king who is corrupting the line of David. Well, not the first time, but the first time that he is not Jewish. Because the Bible tells us clearly the three criteria for the king of the Hebrews. And make the distinction, please. Hebrews, not Jews. Abraham was not Jewish, and David didn't have a clue that he will be called the Jewish king. Hebrews, Israelites. All right, that's the right term, days of the Old Testament. Well, Deuteronomy 7:5 speaks about not an alien, somebody from the nation. Genesis 49, Jacob is blessing his son Judah and said the scepter will not remove from Judah until Shiloh comes, right? And when David is asking permission to build a temple to God, God says, you will not establish my house, I will establish yours. And therefore the kings of Israel from David and on, and Saul did not meet the requirements, were a Hebrew, Israelite, Jew, house of Judah, line of David. Herod was not any of those. And therefore we have a major problem. And if that's not bad enough, as you'll see in a minute, if the king is illegit, so to speak, you always have the choice to follow the high priest. He was supposed to be the national, the religious leader. Well, Herod was no fool. He understood that if he is holding his position in an illegitimate way, and he gives a genuine high priest to keep his position, it's going to undermine his. In fact, jeopardize his position. Why would Herod do that? He offers the position for money. And keep in mind, what was the high priest in charge for? You know the answer. Temple? Sacrificial system? Priesthood? If the high priest is illegit, what does it make the whole system? A problem. Most people cooperated. Most people were willing to accept Herod not because they liked him, because there was no choice, and life was good. We speak about times of prosperity, times of tranquility. But I said, the opening statement, that there was no consensus about the temple being indeed the way it should be. That's what I'm talking about. The high priest was not from the line of Aaron. Never happened before that in a given time, the days of Jesus, there was no legitimate leadership to the Jewish people. The king was not from the right line, and neither was the high priest, which is not undermining the position of the temple and the commandment given by God to build the temple. So please make the distinction. The high priest was the most hated character in the country. Chief tax collector, collaborating with the Romans. Why would anybody like him? Do you know that tax collectors could not even testify in the court of law? They could not give money for temple taxes. That's how much people didn't like them back then. So we do speak about a little problem here when we speak about the king making an offer to build a temple. What was the motivation? Well, very clearly, we speak about a great moneymaker. Herod was a mighty king indeed, and Herod could not do what any other king would do under such circumstances, to recruit the largest army and go to conquer the world. And therefore, the only way to make a name for yourself was by construction. And the man was building everywhere, not just in Judea. But the most important project was the temple. The motivation is given to us in the book of Josephus Flavius. He gathers the elders, Sanhedrin, and says something like, well, folks, I want to thank God for everything he gave me. Your God, the God of Israel. I'm wealthy, I'm prosperous, the Romans appreciate me, the kingdom is strong. I do want to thank God. And they said, just a minute now, why would you do something so nice for us? We know your motivation. We're going to destroy the building, and then you will tell us, oops, I can't find enough rocks in Judea, we cannot build another one. And then what do we do? And they said, start working, and we'll give you a final answer when we see that you mean business. The other problem was the Roman Empire. If you build a structure that looks like a mighty castle, fortress, and indeed it was, protected by massive walls, that's an act of rebellion. Rome has to consent before you start building such a major project. And the Romans hesitated as well. So Herod's motivation was basically to provide a large facility to accommodate as many people as possible. We speak about money. 3 times a year, every Jew was commanded to go up to Jerusalem. In the days of Jesus, about 50% of the Jewish population did not live in Judea. In Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Babylon, and everybody came to Jerusalem. Well, not everybody, but many people did. If you don't provide a decent facility, less people will come. Less people will come, well, the treasury won't be as full. If you don't have a nice airport, not that many people will come to visit your country. Well, maybe that's the modern equivalent. And Herod was willing and was wealthy enough for this mighty project. So the motivation in Josephus is to thank God for helping him to fortify, to strengthen his position, but also, of course, that became to be one of the main sources of income. And keep in mind, there are 2 things that we need to remember. People paid their taxes to the temple, half a shekel every year, men, and that was dedicated only for temple maintenance, which means that was not taxes that went to the kingdom's treasury, temple maintenance. But if more people come, more people will spend more money. When Pontius Pilate was governor, he ordered to restore the water system of Jerusalem. And since there were no finances, he made a very good suggestion. Let's take money from the temple's treasure to rebuild the water system. Sounds great, right? Well, not if you know that this money is consecrated, if you wish, only for the sacrifices, the priesthood, not to build any public projects. And the result was a big conflict in Jerusalem as a result of that. So that was the motivation, no doubt. And Herod was not lazy, as you understand. He recruited a division of 10,000 stonemasons. These people were working for a lot of time, and if that was not enough, since the temple was exclusively meant to be a Jewish place, stonemasons that were non-Jews, and some of them were not, could not work in the sacred area. So 1,000 priests were trained specifically to build the building. By the way, without using any tool made of iron. Iron symbols war, bloodshed, weapons. The temple is a house of peace. The temple itself had to be built without using iron inside the complex. So you chisel the stones outside, you dress the stones outside, you carry them inside with all kinds of technologies, nothing made of iron. So that was indeed a big project. And the pictures you're going to see in the presentation are taken from a scale model of Jerusalem that is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Maybe the best way to understand today Jerusalem in the days of Jesus and the temple from the days of Herod. Well, number one, they started 19 BC, the 18th year of Herod's reign. How long did it take to complete the project? Well, Josephus Flavius tells us that they were carving out the stones and brought them to the construction site for 8 years, and 3 years to build the project. He also tells us it never rained in Jerusalem during that time, not to keep the work from completion. Well, the 2nd chapter of John, verse 20, we read 46 years, right? Well, how long did it take? We don't know. But it is possible they never finished the project. Because it wasn't just the building and the Temple Mount. It was the whole infrastructure around. The roads and the bridges and the cleansing facilities. We'll speak about it in a few minutes. That takes time. When Herod died, only 15 years later, 4 BC, maybe the treasury was empty. Maybe the Romans said, just a minute, it's too big, too massive, stop working immediately. If you ever come to Jerusalem, if you have not been yet, I'll be more than happy to take you along the Western Wall Tunnel. You go to the far end and you can clearly see signs over there. The project was not fully completed. But also keep in mind, the sacrifices were going on as regularly, although the temple, for some part, there was no building standing, removing one and rebuilding the other. The sacrifices, they did offer them twice a day in behalf of the nation, We don't speak that much about other offerings, private offering, guilt offerings, burnt offering. We speak about the daily offering. And that was the offering that maintained, so to speak, the connection between God and his people. Because keep in mind, this is a sidetrack I'm taking, but it's very important. Sometimes people approach me and ask me about if I have a private relationship with God. It's a good question, but it's coming more from the Christian side than the Jewish side. The Jewish understanding is a communal one and not that much an individual one. And therefore the idea was, as long as I pay my taxes to the temple and I perform the duties I need to perform in the scriptures, somebody in my behalf is taking care about this relationship. It's not an individual issue. The Jewish religion focuses more on the community than on the individual. You cannot perform many of the laws that Judaism requires unless you're part of a community. You can't even open the scroll of the Torah on your own and read. It requires a certain quorum. So keep that in mind, because the temple was, if you wish, a bottleneck, a channel, a bridge between the nation as a nation and not between every individual and God. There was no commandment in the scriptures to make sacrifices. There is a commandment to pay taxes. Pieces of silver, later on half a shekel. Is that clear? Well, I hope it is. Let's run the whole thing, please, through the whole slide. Thank you. That should be it. Where was I? All right, as we said, the sacrificial system never ceased, and this is the main thing to remember. The plan was to enlarge the platform, actually double the size of the courtyard to make it as big as it is today, but also to make the building a little higher. And the reason in a minute. The challenge was enormous, because Mount Moriah is a mountaintop surrounded by 3 very steep mountainsides. And if you want to enlarge the complex or the compound, you have to build retaining walls from the bottom of the cliffs. And on top of these, you add the platform. And that was not easy to do. You should come and see the huge stone they were using. The second largest stone on earth, weighs about 500 tons, is in the western wall of the temple. The techniques were amazing. We do not know the details. The skills were amazing as well. We speak about a mighty project. The reason why they had to make the temple a little bigger was because of the topography. Well, here is what the Mishnah teaches us, part of the oral law. When you come to Jerusalem for Passover, and you want to have the Passover sacrifice, the city was not big enough to accommodate millions of people. The tradition was that you take your offering lamb into the temple, the priest slaughters the lamb, it's not on the main altar. There were hundreds of slaughtering places for that reason. And then you take the lamb to any of the ovens that were placed in town to roast it, and then you have the Passover with the family in only 2 possible locations, either within the walls of the city or anywhere outside the city, as long as you can have an eye contact with the temple. When they surveyed the mountains around Jerusalem, and they do it every now and then, they found a lot of cooking pots, a lot of things to indicate a meal, because what is the word I'm looking for? The utensils or whatever, the things that you use for this meal, or all the equipment that you're using, you're only using it once for that meal, and then you leave it behind. It's not made of gold, it's made of clay, terracotta. We didn't find not even a piece behind the skyline, because behind the skyline you can see the temple. And therefore, since this part of town, oops, I'm sorry again, yeah, and the next one, and the next one. Since the hill on the left-hand side of Mount Moriah is higher than Mount Moriah is not the highest place in town, by the way. If this was a Roman city, you can move the temple to the highest place if you want. You can do it with the temple in Jerusalem. The city was growing, climbing a hill. You cannot see the temple from the western hill unless you make the temple higher. Which is, if you want to prefer more room for more people to come to Jerusalem, you also want them to be able to stay and have the Passover meal on the western hillsides. You just made room for hundreds of thousands of people. But from the western hillside, you can see the temple if it's low. So they added about 35 feet to the temple building, which was bigger than the biblical requirements. So you can see it from other distances, which means making more room to more people to come, because if you're taking a bird's view of Jerusalem during Passover, it will be quite amazing. Like a huge Colosseum with 2.5 million people or so, camping on the hillsides, having the Passover meal in groups, usually by the place of origin. The group from Nazareth over here, group from Babylon over there. But you can only do that as long as you can see the temple. It doesn't matter which part of the temple, the facade or the back, it doesn't matter. And therefore, considering the topography, they had to elevate the building. So it was visible now from the western side as well. As we said, topography was very important. You have no idea how long does it take just to make these little squares over there. Speaking about the PowerPoint. And my graphic skills are limited. Basically what you see are the measurements, and I used meters because it's too complicated for me to translate it to feet. You do the math, it's about 3.5 times, right? 3.5 times more. Well, the western wall, which we call today the Wailing Wall, that's the size. And you see the southern wall. It was the shape of a trapezoid, basically. And you do see the problem. Bedrock goes very steeply up to Mount Moriah. And therefore, in order to build a platform around the mountain, you have to erect huge retaining walls. And that's how it looks from the east and from the west. And we need to have a model, 3D, to explain that. And we don't have such a model. But as you understand, that was a major challenge. In the Temple Mount, actually the Western Wall, they have a little animated movie, really nice, that tries to explain how they carved out the stones and how they moved them from the quarry to the construction site. But you think about elevating these stones and place them one on top of the other so perfectly well. 2,000 years later, they're still standing. Well, how did they do that? Well, part of the answer is this. When the wall was scanned, and they did it a couple of times with infrared, with ultrasound, they realized between every two stones, which are significant, big stones, there are hundreds of small pieces of lead, which led the historians or the archaeologists to come to the following conclusion. On top of each big stone, they would place hundreds of small balls made of lead. You bring up the next stone. There was a ramp that you had to elevate each time you added another layer. You push this stone up to the top. It wasn't easy, but it was done. The fact is, it's still standing. But there will come a moment that you need to lift up the stone with pulleys and tripods and very carefully lower it down, the stone which is down below. And what if you missed? Let's say that somebody did a mistake. Can you move the stone with all these heavy weight? Well, if the stone is standing on hundreds of small balls made of lead, then you can still push it right and left until the stone gets to its final position. And the next one will crush them. And therefore, between every two big stones, they found all these pieces of lead. Well, to be honest with you, we are not positive that's how it worked, but it makes a lot of sense. Smaller stones, no lead. Bigger stones, you do find those pieces. So that's a possibility. So the techniques are very advanced, as you understand as well. And once again, I need to apologize for my limited, primitive graphic skills. But you do understand, oh yeah, that's the next one. Do you understand, if you look at the Temple Mount from west to east, you do understand the challenge. The slopes are very steep. The retaining walls had to be erected. The platform is resting on top. That was not easy to accomplish because of the topography, but it was done. And if you come today, it's quite amazing to see these huge stones still standing, although we do have some other layers which come from different eras. The way it was built was quite interesting. No connecting material. They were not using any mortar. And the question is, why not? Well, you can build the temple or the retaining walls with smaller stones and use mortar, cement, concrete. Rome knew about concrete. Rome invented concrete. Well, the problem is if you want to make mortar, you need to burn limestone. Limestone under tremendous heat will powder. And then you mix the lime or the powder with water, some other ingredients to make mortar. The problem is that you need to burn limestone. Israel is very poor with timber. We just don't have enough trees in the country to go to such an enormous project. If we had done that, well, not we, if they have done that, somebody calculated you needed to uproot a forest about 25 kilometers long and 15 kilometers wide. We just don't have that amount of timber. And therefore, the alternative was big stones, about 17 feet thick, 3 layers, one behind the other. But if you build those retaining walls and you stuff the inside with dirt, and on top of that you place the platform, then you have a major problem. Because the pressure can be so harsh, the retaining walls might collapse. Even today, when the place is in Muslim hands, Fridays of Ramadan, about 200,000 people come to Temple Mount. It used to be 500,000. And the state of Israel decided to reduce the number because the southern wall of the Temple Mount started bulging and collapsing about 15 years ago. Some of you might have heard about that. So it's a major problem even today. And therefore, to reduce the pressure, it was not stuffed with dirt from within. They've built systems of arches and vaults and caverns, one on top of the other, to level with the mountaintop, and then adding the retaining walls. In other words, if you could see through the wall over there, right, that's the western wall, what you would see on the other side is not dirt filling, you would see those hollow spaces, one on top of the other. Another reason to build it like that the temple needed lots of storage, lots of water cisterns. Just think about the amount of water to wash away the blood from the altar every day after the sacrifices were over. And keep in mind, there were living quarters for the priests on Temple Mount. Every division came to serve in a temple 2 weeks every year, and that's where they lived. And therefore water was required, storage was required. There was a big storage for salt, because every sacrifice was supposed to be offered with some salt. And salt was a rare commodity and a very precious back then. And therefore these hollow spaces were also exploited for food, for water. When the Jews went to war against Rome, that was the arsenal, if you wish, of the whole city. The hollow spaces, the tunnels, the vaults and the caverns out under the platform and behind the retaining walls. But there was another reason why to build it like that, and this is the one that I'm sure you're going to like in particular. Where we still do a big issue today in the Jewish world from purification. The Bible speaks about the necessity of cleansing people that were defiled because of many reasons. A woman, after having her period every month, is supposed to do that. After giving birth, a man's supposed to do that if he touched a dead body or a carcass of an animal. There are many rules why to do that. One of them was, when you go up to Temple Mount, you need to prepare yourself somehow with cleansing, and we'll speak about it in just a minute. But here's the problem for you. Let's say that somebody was buried on the hillside thousands of years earlier. We don't even know about it, but there are dead bones under the platform of the holy mountain. Dead bones will defile the whole mountain. And the fact that we don't know beyond any doubt that there are dead bones, it's not good enough. Well, how do we solve this one? You go to check with the commentators. Rabbi, we have a problem. What are we going to do? Well, here's the answer. If you have air, any kind of air between the dead bone and where you're standing, that's kosher, because the impurity only travels, if you wish, through solid rock and not through air. There are places in Jerusalem today that buildings which are built on top of what is suspected to be an old graveyard are built on pillars and columns. You have to leave a little bit of air between a possible source of contamination and where you are, let alone when it comes to Temple Mount. Josephus tells us in one occasion a couple of Samaritans infiltrated a Jewish caravan that made its way to Temple Mount, and they had dead bones in their backpacks. They just spread them all around Temple Mount. Can you imagine the catastrophe as a result of that? Of course, provoking the Jews, the Samaritans did not believe that Jerusalem should be the place of Temple Mount. They believed another mountain, Mount Gerizim. So these are the three reasons why the temple was built in such a way. Some of it was practical logic. The other one was a theological requirement, not to have any dead bones coming in touch with people that are walking on top of the platform. And as I just mentioned, okay, let's move to the next one. Thank you. Well, that's how basically the diagram of the temple used to look like. And just to give you a basic idea, the extension that was made by Herod was not considered to be of holy significance. That was the Gentiles' court. That was the marketplace. That's what the money changers used to be, and many others. So the temple itself was divided to two sections, the Gentiles' court, or the marketplace, and on the elevated platform was the very temple. And that's how it looked like. Facing east, the facade was facing east, the women court, and there were 15 stairs that led up to another gate that was called the Nicanor Gate. That's where the Levites were standing, providing the music to the ceremony. And the inside court was only for men. Into the sanctuary, the priests, and into the Holy of Holies, only once a year, Yom Kippur, there for Tanam and the high priest. So that's how the temple was, or looked like, very similar in the principles to Solomon's temple, obviously, and Zerubbabel's temple. The necessity to have a sanctuary and a Holy of Holies. By the way, there were two veils, as we know from the Mishnah curtains, that separated the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. That's in the Mishnah. The reason for that was that when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, or accidentally because of a strong wind, somebody kicked the curtain by any chance, it's a possibility. If you move the veil, everybody can look into the Holy of Holies. And therefore there were two. When the high priest went in on Yom Kippur, he would move the first one, stand between the curtains, and then move the second one. I wrote about the ritual cleansing and about the necessity to cleanse yourself before you go up to Temple Mount. Well, you see there is a quote over there from Psalms, which is, well, the one that I like in particular. Who may ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and pure heart. I think that many of us won't qualify, right? And therefore, before you go up to the temple, you need to go through a certain procedure of spiritual cleansing. The Bible speaks about the necessity of cleansing, doesn't give us the specifics, and that's where the commentators went in. Well, the entrance to the temple for pilgrims was from the south. And what you see on the lower left-hand side over there from the same model of Jerusalem, you see the southern wall of the temple. You see the stairs that you can all visit. The stairs are still there. And that was their entrance. Why coming from south? Well, because of two main reasons. When the first temple was built in Solomon's days, Jerusalem, the town, was made of City of David, Temple Mount, which means naturally you come from the City of David up, you're coming from south. This temple, Herod's temple, the city was so big and climbed mountains around Old Testament Jerusalem that for every side that you're approaching the temple, you're walking down hills. And it's inappropriate to go down hills when you go to the place of worship. If you came for your daily business, well, you can go in from any gate you want. But if you came as a pilgrim, and that's the reason of your visit, you don't go down to the high place, right? Sounds an oxymoron, go down to the high place. You climb. And the only side that you would climb to go up to Mount Moriah is coming from south. And that became to be the tradition. Pilgrims would go into the temple after cleansing themselves in this mikveh from south. But there was another problem. Let's say that you want to save a shekel, huh? You don't want to go and pay the mikveh people for the mikveh. Who can tell? They wouldn't give you a little certificate to tell you, I'm okay, let me in. Well, the priests could not really trust the people to do that. They were standing on both sides of the entrance, jars at their feet filled with water, mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. When you guys say holy cow, that's a red heifer, the holy cow of Numbers 19. And they were holding hyssop branches in their hands, dipping in the water, sprinkle on people, maybe, just maybe, the way to understand the psalm that speaks about cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be whiter than snow. It's a possibility. If David is the psalmist, and we believe he is, there was no temple yet. But maybe later on, that was the connection between cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be whiter than snow. Well, a few pictures of the temple from four sides. The facade was facing east, as you understand. And you see the facade of the building. And keep in mind, the sources to the model are coming from the Mishnah. We do not have pictures, no graffitis were found. And we do have a lot of Roman temples that are still standing, and Greek temples. They're very much the same. The architecture is Roman, and the whole concept of sanctuary, Holy of Holies, is very similar to Herod's temple as well. Do you see there is a roof over there? The top has some of those golden spikes. They have to think about everything, huh? That was to keep the birds away so the droppings won't mess the walls of the building. So they had the golden fence. By the way, Herod could not resist his temptation to show loyalty to Rome. And above the entrance, he placed a huge eagle. That's an image. That's an image in the temple. And the end result was that some people, zealous from Galilee, tried to remove that. And of course, he killed them. But think about it. You build this whole project. You want to do it as right as possible to please the people and encourage more people to come. And then you kick the bucket, as I say, in the very midst of it. An eagle, a Roman sovereignty symbol. If you look at the southern wall and you see the entrances, the stairs which are over there, the buildings down below were the mikveh places, the cleansing places. The Bible tells us on Pentecost Day, 3,000 people were baptized, remember? There's only one place in town that could accommodate so many people in such a short time, and that was what you see in the picture. Before you go up into the temple, all the cleansing places, the mikvehs, were by the southern wall of the Temple Mount. The northern wall, it's hard to see, but, thank you, it's hard to see, but on the lower right-hand side, there was a gate over there that the Bible calls in John chapter 5 the sheep gate. Now there is a pool, the Bible says, on the Sabbath day. Remember when he healed the man by the pool of Bethesda. So that's the sheep gate over there through which the daily offering was brought into the main altar. They bring the sheep to the pool of Bethesda, wash it, shear it, and take it through the north of the sheep gate into the temple's courtyard for the altar. The western wall, maybe the most famous one today, is the western retaining wall of Temple Mount. Is that clear? Retaining wall. When people go to the Wailing Wall today, they don't go to pray and to pay respects or whatever by one of the walls of the temple, but it's a retaining wall of Temple Mount. When the temple was standing, the western wall was of no religious significance. It was just a retaining wall. Why people go there and not any other wall today? Well, because the western wall was the closest one to the Holy of Holies, and the desire today is to go as close as you can to the Holy of Holies. But the wall as a wall had no significance. And of course, there's a Jewish principle that you, of course, can relate to very easily. God is not in places and God is not in stones. The reason why the western wall became to be sacred requires a whole presentation. We don't have time to speak about it now, but this is known as the Jewish holy place today. Little more details about the temple and how it used to look like. You see the Sodom steps, we spoke about that. On top of it was the basilica. That was a big indoors marketplace. The word basilica is not coming from the world of religion. It's coming from the world of architecture. It's a Greek name, named after the king Basileus. That was the biggest marketplace that every town had. In the case of Jerusalem, on top of Temple Mount. The Gentiles' court, that was covering most of the area. That was the extension added by Herod. And then you see there was a low, kind of a wall or a fence that was marking the holy or distinguishing the holy from the non-holy. From that point on, only Jews could go in. If you were not a Jew, you were welcome to Temple Mount, but not to go beyond that fence. And on the upper right-hand side, you see one of those stones that was found. It's in a museum in Istanbul today that warns foreigners in Latin, Greek, and Aramaic not to go beyond this point. All right, so that's a stone over there. Then you see, of course, the building itself, the temple, the women court, and the fortress on the right-hand side that is called the Antonia Fortress, also known as Praetorium. That's where the trial of Jesus took place. That was the headquarters of the Roman governor when he was in town. And it was called Antonia because it was built by Herod to honor his good friend, actually his patron at first, Mark Antony, before he was killed by Octavian. So that's how the temple area used to look like. And of course, the eastern gate down at the bottom, if you come to the city today, you see a gate, but it's not the one that you see in this diagram. This one is covered by the Roman siege ramp. The new gate was built right above. So that's how the temple used to look like. And just a few words, because the clock is ticking, about the priesthood and the way that they performed in the temple, the Kohanim in Hebrew. Well, they were divided to 24 orders from the days of David. You go to Chronicles, the first, I should say, institutionalized religion was founded in David's days. The priesthood, the orders, the singers, the gatekeepers, David was the one responsible for that. And you find it in the book of Chronicles. Every order served in the temple 2 weeks every year. And by the way, since they did not know who is going to be in charge of what as the priesthood, they had to train them from a very young age to know how to function in case something is assigned to them, but they did not know that in advance. So a young priest from the day, not the day he was born, but from a certain age, was trained to be able to fulfill every function in the temple when the time comes. And since they only required 24 people for a shift, and there were only about 3 shifts a day, there were good chances that the priest will never perform anything in the temple. It was by casting lots, remember? And therefore, you would prepare all of your life, you would go up with your division to serve in the temple, and sometimes you would go back home quite disappointed because you didn't have the fortune, so to speak, and you did not have the privilege to do anything in the temple. Yet the priests were entitled to enjoy the tithes and the offerings, and they were given by the people. The other thing is, if you read down below the ones when Zechariah speaking about John the Baptist, of course we speak about those lots. A little kind of interesting, but how, and that's what Mishnah tells us. Each time that one duty was over, everybody will gather in the chamber of hewn stone, the Sanhedrin headquarters. The high priest will draw the lots over there, sending some other people to do their jobs, and all the others disappointed. And it was a routine almost every day. You did not know if you're going to perform any of it in the temple. By the way, you started serving when you were 30 years of age, not before that. 30 years of age, you did not have any blemish, any defect, any deformity, then you could serve in the temple. Just as a closing thing, I would like to mention the red heifer issue because it's really intriguing in many ways. The greatest Jewish scholar was called Maimonides, and Maimonides wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchim, tries to give the explanation to the 613 commandments in the scriptures. When he gets to the red heifer, he says, I don't have a clue. That's it. The most clever, the most celebrated Jewish scholar ever says, I have no idea what stands behind that. But the red heifer was one of those commandments the Bible speaks about, connected with the tabernacle. All right? You go to Numbers 19. When you come to Jerusalem centuries later, you need to find somehow how to fit that in the town, the geography, topography, and the red heifer was one of those issues that can help us today to find out where exactly was the temple standing, because we have some debates about the exact location of the temple. Maybe not where the Dome of the Rock stands today. All right? And that's supposed to help us, because the Mishnah says, when the high priest assistant was burning the red heifer, you needed ashes for purification because the old one was gone. The altar for that was built on Mount of Olives, and from that location, the man could see above the eastern gate into the temple. Which means altar, gate, temple, supposed to be on the same line. We know that the gate is on the same location, no doubt. We do not know where is the altar. And that's part of the missing factors to know beyond any doubt where exactly was the temple standing. Now the fact that we don't know the location doesn't mean anything. Temple Mount is the mountain. That was the choice that God made, built by Solomon, built by Zerubbabel, rebuilt by Herod. And as Jonathan was singing earlier, we should all sing Shema Israel on top of Temple Mount. And here comes the rose. The rose, yeah. Well, folks, thank you very much. That was a little different than what you heard so far. I hope that it helped to understand a little bit about the city, topography, temple, the position of the temple, the controversy around the temple, and some of the details and the data about Herod's temple. Thank you.